But first, investigators are trying to determine why a 21-year-old man allegedly opened fire on a 4th of July parade in a Chicago suburb.
That's right. It happened Monday morning, just before 10:30 a.m. local time in Highland Park, Illinois. Police say the gunman climbed onto a building rooftop and fired into the crowd. 6 people were killed and more than 24 others were shot and taken to local hospitals. Officials say those shot range in age from 8 to 85. Hours later, police arrested the accused gunman. Charges have not yet been filed against him, but the mayor of Highland Park tells CBS News those could come later today.
CBS News correspondent Kris Van Cleave is in Highland Park with the latest. So, Kris, what more can you tell us about the information that officials just released?
Well, let's start with a piece of good news. The police told us that all of the children who were injured or wounded so far are still alive. So, you've had 6 people killed, more than 30 injured. All of the children that were wounded yesterday, survivors at this point. We learned a lot about the shooter here, that he disguised himself in women's clothing, and that would be an attempt to blend into the crowd, to disappear. He had very distinct facial and neck tattoos, so dressed in women's clothing to hide his identity and capitalize on the chaos to disappear. We know that he was on the rooftop of one of the buildings back behind us here. He used a fire escape ladder to get up there. Police, this is essentially a deliberate act with random victims. Witnesses have told us that it seemed like he sprayed the crowd with bullets. So no evidence that this was targeting a specific group of people, that this wasn't racially or religion motivated. It appears to be a planned, deliberate act that was targeting random people. He left behind a firearm, a high-powered rifle likened to something similar to an AR-15. That was found at the scene. That certainly aided police. We also learned that there was a lot of video evidence, including the suspect in women's attire, that allowed him to be quickly identified. So that was a big thing. He was also, when he was arrested, there was another rifle in the vehicle when he was arrested. He was only about 5 miles from the scene here. We know he went to his mother's house after, appeared to change clothes, but was still armed with another rifle. There were handguns found at another location that apparently he owned as well. All of the guns legally purchased. But this was an act that appears to be premeditated. What we don't know is the motive or if there was a bigger plan. Why did he stay in town, for example?
And Kris, as you said, the motive is not yet clear. So where does the investigation go from here? How complete is the timeline at this point?
Well, it sounds like with the FBI's help, there's a fairly clear mosaic of video, at least, that tracks the incident. They were able to identify him pretty quickly and were able to find him within 8 hours. So next stage of the investigation, still fact-finding. We're only 24 hours in. So they want to understand what may have caused that, what may have been the motive, what may have led up to this, as well as trying to understand if anyone else was aware of his plans. That if you had viewed his social media, there were clear red flags in his social media that touched on gun violence, that referenced violence with the police. Did anyone see those red flags? We heard from his uncle yesterday that he didn't, that he saw no indications that this was coming. So that's certainly one of the things they're going to ask. There's trying to understand the why. Right. Sounds like they've got a decent sense on the how. So now it becomes the why, and that might be a trickier question. And having covered the Boston Marathon bombing with you, Elaine, that trial, and as well as the Virginia Tech shooting and the Navy Yard shooting, very rarely do you get an answer to the why that's satisfactory.
Yeah,
but that's certainly one of the things police are going to try to piece together.
It's very true, Kris. And I wonder, you mentioned this sort of video trail and the fact that according to the video and according to authorities, it was this disguise of women's clothing that allowed the suspect, they say, to blend in with the crowd and escape. How was it that investigators were able to track down the suspect and apprehend the suspect? And also, any word on, at this point, whether anyone else may have been involved in this attack?
So at this point, police believe this was a lone wolf style attack, and those are particularly hard to predict and prevent and disrupt. Now, obviously, 24 hours into the investigation, that could change, but right now this looks like a deliberate act by one person. how did they piece together the suspect? Well, they had the benefit of having the firearm that was used. They had the rifle. That gave them some tools. They had a lot of video evidence. If we look around this community, I guarantee you there are a lot of security cameras up and down this street. There are a lot of cell phone videos. The FBI is very good now at piecing those together and creating a timeline. That helped. Also helped that this individual had a very distinct appearance. So they got a witness that spotted him after he had left the scene here, reported it to police, and because, again, you had a very distinct person with distinct facial tattoos, they knew the vehicle they were looking for, it became easier for police to spot him. But, you know, the disguise and the disappearing, that shows you that this suspect had thought about what he was doing. He attempted to blend in, ditching the gun, putting on women's clothing and disappearing into a panicked crowd. He essentially vanished for the moment. But it's hard to get away from the watchful eye of those security cameras, and it caught up to him. It just took about 8 hours, but they found him.
Certainly seems to indicate that premeditation. All right, well, Kris Van Cleave, thank you so much for all of that. We're going to bring in now CBS News Homeland Security and Justice reporter Nicole Sganga. Nicole, I want to ask you first off the top, though, you know, the fact that this suspect's digital trail is being scrutinized right now. Apparently, we're reading, you know, there were very violent images that he posted online, violent screeds, but to listservs where other people seem to be approving of them, right? And possibly posting similar violent images. I mean, my understanding is that these listservs or these online communities were sort of like-minded. So does this mean now that, you know, investigators are going to be piecing through all of the people who are responding to his images and seeing if perhaps they pose a similar threat?
Yeah, it's absolutely the case that there were significant amounts of digital evidence which helped lead investigators to the direction of the suspect in this case. YouTube videos, a Discord channel, social media posts that had violent images. The suspected shooter posted music on, several streaming platforms under a pseudonym, including music videos that featured darker lyrics, animated scenes of gun violence, and animation of a gunman who resembled the suspect's very distinct appearance and is seen wearing tactical gear. And at least one of these videos, what we know about domestic violent extremism writ large in this country is that individuals, lone wolf attackers, frequently derive inspiration from previous attacks, previous acts of violence. So I do want to be careful about how I characterize some of this content. But, according to the Highland Park mayor, many of these online postings reflected a plan and a desire to commit carnage for a long time in advance. Of course, we know that the Department of Homeland Security last month issued a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin warning that in the aftermath of the Buffalo and the Uvalde shootings, it is possible that copycat attacks or similarly styled attacks could take place. Now, of course, this investigation remains in its early stages, but what we do know is that similar to the Uvalde and Buffalo shootings, the weapon used by the suspected shooter on Monday was purchased legally, this one in Illinois. Police described that firearm as a high-powered rifle, similar to an AR-15, again, very similar to what we saw in Uvalde and during the Buffalo shooting, no indications that the weapon was modified, but right now, authorities working to trace the origins of that firearm. That's a job, of course, for the ATF. I also want to point out that 6 of the 11 deadliest mass shootings in the United States since 2018 were committed by individuals who were 21 years of age or younger. That includes both the Uvalde and Buffalo shooting. Now, most recently in Highland Park, 6 people have died, scores of others injured in this most recent tragedy. Absolutely heartbreaking. What's just as heartbreaking is this most recent shooting doesn't even make that list, but similarly, the gunman here, or I should say, the person of interest, there have been no charges issued as of yet, but the suspect fits into that disturbing trend of younger people committing or suspected of committing these mass atrocities.
Right. There certainly seems to be a pattern here that we have seen, as you point out, Nicole. I wonder if you could just elaborate a bit further on the role of the federal government here. How is the Department of Homeland Security Secretary responding to this latest mass shooting? And how are the feds aiding in this investigation? You talked about, of course, the ATF when it came to getting a bit more detail on the weapon involved.
Yeah, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has been briefed on this shooting. The agency is coordinating right now with local, state, and federal partners to offer their support. They have within the Department of Homeland Security an office called the Office of Intelligence and Analysis that, similar to what we just talked about with social media, does scan and monitor some of these social media websites. It looks for calls to violence specifically in some of these online forums that tend to house and harbor domestic violent extremist sympathizers, I should say. And so certainly the Department of Homeland Security looking for that, also offering any information they might find online to federal law enforcement. Just this past Sunday, the Secretary of Homeland Security told our Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation that domestic violent extremism is one of, if not the greatest terrorism-related threat that we face in the homeland today. Individuals spurred by ideologies of hate, false narratives, personal grievances to acts of violence. Of course, we did just hear from police just now during that press conference that there are no indications this was a racially or ethnically motivated act of violence, but we're still learning more about the person of interest here. And certainly federal law enforcement will be part of creating a profile of that suspect to determine really what his motives were, the why that Kris Van Cleave was just talking about. And so, the U.S. has become increasingly challenged. Federal law enforcement has become increasingly challenged to track some of these online threats. We're beginning to see a blending of ideologies here in the threat environment's online echo chamber, both foreign and domestic threat actors engaging on extremist platforms, including on encrypted apps. And young people are incredibly impacted by some of this, influenced. It's challenging sometimes for federal law enforcement to try to intervene when they have fewer and fewer dots to connect.
Nicole Sganga, so great to get all the background from you. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.